speaking of that, honored to have with us on our decision maker line, Pat Buchanan, author of a brand new book, which certainly will be a bestseller, Suicide of a Superpower. Pat Buchanan, welcome to Focal Point with Bryan Fischer.
Thank you very much, Brian. Delighted to be here on the Wildman's Network.
Yes, well, and you know, Pat, I haven't had a chance to read all of the book, but I've read enough. It's a very sobering book. I mean, the title of the book, Pat, Suicide of a Superpower. So that's kind of the theme, is kind of what America has done. You know, George Washington said that the two indispensable props and pillars for political prosperity were religion and morality, and you talk about some of the ways in which we have subverted those great pillars. So talk to us a little bit about what you're seeing and why you wrote this book.
Well, that's one of the why I wrote the book, is I wanted to try to look back and see what I look back at the tremendous country we grew up in, and I wanted to know what happened to it in various ways in terms of its decline, which 70% of the American people believe is happening, that it's on the wrong course, 80%. And you look back and see what it was, and the answer is we did it to ourselves, Brian, and one of the ways we did it is with the steady rejection of the Christian roots of the American nation and Western civilization, and the loss of faith, the declining faith among all the Christian churches that you see going on. And of course, religion, as Washington and Adams indicated, is the source of all morality and the source of ethics. And when the religion goes, the culture goes, the civilization goes, and finally the people begin to die. And that's what's happening to Western peoples now, not only in the United States, but in every country in Europe.
And, you know, we're seeing that even, Pat, even this morning, President Obama ripping the Republicans, who yesterday reaffirmed by an overwhelming bipartisan majority the national motto, "In God We Trust," and President Obama's out there ripping the Republicans for doing that today, and yet he is a president who has omitted any mention of the Creator numerous times when he recites the Declaration of Independence. We saw the United States Supreme Court earlier this week refuse to take an appeal of a case which is going to yank some crosses off of Utah roadways that are there to memorialize the death of Utah law enforcement officers that lost their lives in the line of duty. Supreme Court saying those have to go. So we just see almost on a daily basis more efforts to purge America's public square of any mention of God.
Well, it's the de-Christianization of America. And if the faith Christianity gave birth to our civilization and you reject it, again, the culture will die, the civilization will die, and the people will begin to die. And what you're seeing is basically, Brian, I think a triumph of a 1960s movement which was rooted in whether you call it secularism or cultural Marxism, but in an ideology which is deeply antithetical to Christianity and all its teachings and all its beliefs. And this has triumphed and taken over some of the conscience-forming institutions of America, the mind-forming institutions in Hollywood and the academic community and many of the public schools, and it has been systematically purging Christianity as its mortal enemy. And the astonishing thing is how we let this happen. An overwhelmingly 95% Christian nation around 1960 let this happen and let this be done to us without more resistance.
Well, and one of the problems that you touch on is the weakness in our immigration policy, failing to secure the borders, and then having sort of this willy-nilly immigration policy where we invite people to come into our nation who do not strengthen our cultural fabric, but weaken it, who come in and are determined to hang on to their own values, their own traditions, instead of assimilating and becoming Americans with no hyphens.
Well, that's right. The earlier immigrants who came in, the Irish and the Polish and many of the Jewish and the others who came in from just, I guess, in the late 19th, early 20th century, were deeply Americanized, and Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, even, who were on opposite sides politically, both demanded it. Our public and parochial schools, our faith, and all the rest of it, and our culture and traditions, we were all steeped and immersed in that melting pot, and we emerged from it as all Americans. Now the melting pot has been rejected. At the same time, the elites have thrown open America's borders for people from all cultures, civilizations, religions, creeds all over the world, and they tell these folks, come on over here and stay as you are. But that's going to turn us into a a continental-sized Balkan peninsula of people who have very little in common and people who disagree with each other and even detest each other in ways. I think they are really rolling the dice with the American Republic.
When you look at Europe, Pat, and you allude to this in the book, we can see what's happening in Europe, and it's kind of it's a sneak preview of what is going to happen in the United States if we don't sort of wake up. And, you're seeing people in Europe in one nation after another that are beginning to recognize the abysmal failure of multiculturalism. I mean, the Prime Minister of England's come out against it, the Chancellor of Germany, President of France, all of them saying, look, multiculturalism has been a disaster. And so the question is, I guess, Pat, are we going to wake up to the dangers of multiculturalism in time to save what's left of America?
Well, that's a very good question. Merkel, I mean, when 9/11 happened in the Turkish and Islamic portions of Berlin, while the German government expressed solidarity with the United States and anguish over what happened, they were firing bottle rockets in celebration. The Muslims in the banlieues of Paris have come out repeatedly and torched thousands of cars. We saw riots all over London. All three prime ministers and presidents, as you said, have said multiculturalism has utterly failed. When we see that right over there, and they admit it in Europe, what are we doing? Throwing open our doors to everybody on earth, telling them, come here as you are, stay as you are, we're not going to impose cultural genocide on you. How do we remain one nation and one people when we no longer have a common faith, a common moral code, a common moral consensus, common traditions, common culture?
One of the suggestions I've made, and have been hammered for it, and I want to get your take on this, I've suggested that it's time for us to reconsider Islamic immigration because we're inviting into our shores people who do not share Western values. Islam, all the values in Sharia law are absolutely fundamentally contrary to all of the values and freedoms that we cherish in the West. And so I've suggested maybe we need to rethink whether we can afford any more Muslim immigration into the U.S., whether we can afford to have more mosques built. Do you think that's too extreme, or do you think there's another way we can deal with the threat that Islam poses to our cultural fabric?
Well, in Europe, and they had a referendum in Switzerland that no more minarets, any prayer towers on the existing mosques, and they condemn the wearing of the burqa that's forced upon Muslim women. And in France and all across Europe, they're applauding those decisions. Now, Europe is far more to the left than the United States, but I think you're absolutely correct. Look, we have to bring in here people who really share our views and values. All those immigrants that came in the 19th century, early 20th century, came in from predominantly, overwhelmingly Christian countries and European and Western countries and peoples, so that while they were different from us, there was a similarity in belief and values and faith. And so we had something to build on, and also they came here desirous and anxious to become Americans. And this is not true. I think we ought to have a timeout right now on all immigration until our unemployment level goes from 9% to 6%, because I think it's wrong to our people, all of our people, to bring in millions of hardworking folks and give them green cards when 25 million Americans are unemployed or underemployed.
We keep seeing instances. I read a story this morning from Alabama. They've got a new, tougher immigration law there. And the people from south of the border are self-deporting. The schools in Alabama are kind of emptying out. This is a political story, and they're saying these people are not coming back. And there was some kind of a meatpacking plant in one of the towns that was profiled in the New York Times. And when they had a job fair, because all of these illegal aliens vanished, went back home, they had a line around the block of Americans, those are illegal residents, that were willing to take those jobs. So it's just simply not true that there are jobs that Americans are not willing to do.
Well, that you make Brian, a very good point. When I campaigned in 1996 in Iowa, there was the Iowa beef packing plant, where what they did was they cut the wages of American workers 40%, and they quit, and then they brought in illegal aliens to do the work. And so when their wages were cut 40%, the fellow running the place, his wages went from $400,000 to $4 million. And you got to ask us, what are we doing to our own people here? I mean, the first concern of a family, you do charitable work and all the rest of it, that's an obligation. But the first concern of a father of a family is to take care of his own family. And that's what we ought to concern ourselves with right now. And when you see folks, again, I'm not saying these are bad people in many other lands and things, but if they subscribe to a religion which is antithetical to ours and in conflict on many issues of values and belief, and they intend to adhere to those, and that faith is militant, you pick and choose who's going to come into your home. You pick and choose. There's nothing wrong with that.
And immigration is a privilege, not a right. One last question, about 60 seconds left, Pat. Talking here with Pat Buchanan, author of the brand new bestseller, Suicide of a Superpower. This is a little bit off the topic of your book, but how important is it that Americans select next year in November leadership, both in the House, the Senate, and to occupy the Oval Office that share fundamental, historic American ideals? What's at stake in this election?
It is imperative. Simply on the economic question alone and the political question of deadlock in Washington, if we don't get a Republican Senate as well as a Republican House and a Republican president in the place of President Obama and remove him, I think we will have 4 more years of the kind of gridlock we've had for the last year and a half, and I believe that the United States will follow Italy and Greece right down that same road into bankruptcy.
And the question that you asked, Pat, will America survive to 2025? It's a profoundly unsettling question, but an absolutely critical question for us to ask and for us to answer. And you've taken a big step to help us think through these issues in your brand new book, Suicide of a Superpower. Talking with Pat Buchanan, author of the brand new book, Suicide of a Superpower. Pat, thank you so much. I just appreciate how bold and unapologetic you are in advocating for your values, and thanks for taking time to be with us.
Can you say hello to my friends Don and Tim?
I sure will do that. Thank you, Pat.
Bye-bye.
Pat Buchanan, brand new book, again, disturbing book, and he's raising the question, will America survive till 2025? I mean, he's thinking we may have another 14 years, and as we were talking there at the end of the segment, if we re-elect the same leadership we've had for the last 4, there may be very little of America left to say by 2016. Focal Point, AFR Talk.